Okay, it's 5 after. I think we should get rolling. Welcome everybody. This is the third in our webinar series this year. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Bill Rand. He comes to us from North Carolina State University. He got his PhD in computer science at the University of Michigan. And among all of the other amazing things he's done with his career so far, as I'm sure everyone's aware, he's the co-author of this fabulous book that you can't see. That's great. An introduction to agent-based modeling, and he co-authored it with Yuri Walensky of the Netlogo fame. We're all painfully familiar with Netlogo, I suspect. And one of the main reasons why we pestered Bill until he finally agreed to join us for the webinar is because one of the things that I very much enjoy about his work is that he does computational social science sort of full circle. And what I mean by that is that he gets he sees an interesting pattern in nature. He finds data to then get a deeper insight into it. He then builds models to test his hypotheses about what are creating these structures that he's finding in the data. And so he can test the hypotheses and then has a data set that he generates that you can then analyze and so on. And so it's a cycle where we see some structure, we gather data about it, we analyze the data, we test our hypotheses about the data with simulation and generative methods, and then we analyze that data, we refine our hypothesized mechanisms and so on. And I find that to be a very compelling way of doing computational social science. And so I felt that, since this is our first year doing these webinars, it was very important to get Bill to present. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Bill. And don't forget, this is live. We are recording it. Please keep yourself on mute. If you have questions, type them into the chat. I will be monitoring chat, as will Elizabeth, and we will make sure the questions get asked to Bill. And Bill, feel free to fill in any gaps of your background that you'd like. I gave an extremely terse introduction to you. And also, let us know if you want us to interrupt you with questions or if you'd rather us ask them at the end.
Thank you. Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to be interrupted along the way for sure. And thank you very much for the introduction, Matt. That's fantastic. And I think it actually is a perfect intro for this particular talk. And this talk kind of came about because I became I had been doing agent-based modeling for a long time. I was at Northwestern doing agent-based modeling with Uri, and then I went to the University of Maryland, and I was there for 8 years and did a bunch of agent-based modeling there. But while I was at Maryland, and when I kind of switched from computer science to marketing as an academic profession, I kind of started I'm realizing that there was a lot of work to be done on the marketing side in terms of machine learning and data mining. And so I kind of spent some time doing just basically machine learning and data mining, and still do some of that. And then I came about, a couple of years ago, came to the epiphany that maybe it would be useful to combine these two fields, right? Maybe it'd be useful to combine agent-based modeling with machine learning. And that's really where this talk comes from. So it's almost exactly what Matt is talking about. And I'm now at NC State University, and I continue to do this work. Let me talk a little bit about it. And I should say there was one other inspiration for this particular chapter, which is that a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I believe it was, DARPA hosted with the Rand Corporated, with Rand, no relation to me, a meeting in Santa Monica on the future of computational social modeling, right? And this was kind of a small presentation I gave there, and it became a longer book chapter as well. So these are things that a lot of people are thinking about. But let me start, anyways, enough about the background of where this comes from. So I got interested in the idea. Let me advance the slide. There it goes. Okay. In the idea that, there's really all this great big data out there, right? And we hear about big data all the time. And, in marketing, especially, I see the fact that individuals are leaving their footprints and, literal fingerprints in the digital sand at time, right? And it's all there. It doesn't necessarily represent exactly what people are doing, right? Like we see a tweet about something doesn't mean that person's even actually there necessarily, but it gives us some indication of their behavior, right? It gives us some insight into human behavior. And at times there's been some people who talk negatively about this data, calling it digital exhaust, right? But to me, even if you think of that as a literal metaphor, right? The exhaust of a car tells you where the car is going, right? So like if you track the exhaust, you can find out what's happening, right? So there are things in this data to be found, even if it's not exactly what we necessarily want all the time. And so how can we use these signals? How can we use this data to start to understand new insights into human behavior and social science, right? And there's a lot of opportunities there, but the challenge, right, is what do you do with all that data, right? The aggregation of that data eliminates the richness of it, right? If you take 1 million data records and you just look at means and standard deviations of the variables, right, you're not really doing much more than we could have done with simple little data sets or sample data sets, right? The real benefit, I believe, of big data is when that data is used at the individual level, when we start to understand individual differences, individual aspects to it. So how do you make sense of that individual level information, right? Besides just looking at every single row in your gigantic, data sheet, right? Well, that's where we come to the idea of taking a technique that I think this community is well aware of, which is agent-based modeling and driving big data with it, right? Agent-based modeling essentially provides a way for us to understand individual level interactions, but traditionally these models have been done theoretically, right? If you look back at some of the earliest models, you look back at Schelling's tipping model and the Axelrod model, the prisoner's evolution of cooperation models, the prisoner's dilemma models, right? The artificial economic agents of Holland and Miller, right? All these models were essentially done from theory. Now, there have been some efforts, there have been quite a few efforts actually to build data-driven agent-based models in the past, but still I would say the vast majority of publications that you see focus on theoretically based agent-based models. If we could instead create these models directly from data, then we'd have an individual level detailed model, right? And if we had the right tools, this might give us the ability to build a policy flight simulator directly from the data, right? So one of the nice things is that if we're building a model of, say, a street network in a city, right, and we're actually accurately modeling how people are commuting about that city, right, in an agent-based model, we can now look at things like what happens if we take a road away, what happens if we put a road in, right? But what we don't want to do with that model and what would be harmful and what would prevent it from being used as that kind of a flight simulator would be if the models that the agents were running were black box, right? So you could imagine a world in which I just build a deep neural net for each agent, right? And I simply takes the inputs of what it's trying to achieve and takes these outputs of moving around its community, right? But if I have no way of actually knowing why it's making those decisions, right, it becomes very hard for me to kind of try to think about policy interventions that might correct behavior, might alter outcomes, might change the way that those agents are moving, right? So what we want is a theory interpretable model. And we want this for a number of reasons besides just the fact that it's useful for doing policy interventions, right? Another reason is that historically, big data models that have no attachment to theory have gone off the rails, right? So if you look at, for instance, Google Flu Trends, right? Google Flu Trends was extremely popular for a while. It was a tool that could predict flu weeks out ahead of time when peak flu season would occur. And it worked very well for about 2 or 3 years. And then it started wildly under and over predicting flu seasons, right? And why was this? Well, it was, this was a model that was built by some of the best people in this space, right? They basically correlated search results on Google with flu patterns, right? But the problem with big data is that any large scale set of data, you're going to find spurious correlations, right? And as a result of that, you're going to build models that may work for a little while, but don't work in the long run necessarily, because the correlations fall apart for a variety of reasons. Only if you have an ability to inspect a model and show that there's a likely causal theory explaining it, do you really have the ability to create a big data model that's going to go on for a while, right? One of my favorite examples of this, right, for the people who say that, oh, we don't need theory anymore, we can just use data, is the margin and divorce case. It's actually true that for about a decade, the sale of margarine in the United States was almost perfectly correlated with the divorce rate in Maine, right? And this held up to something like the 6th degree of correlation, like it was a 0.9999 correlation, right? Something along those lines. And it's a classic example of why we still need theory in these models, right? Now, that being said, I think that, as you might expect from that expostulation, right, models should be interpretable from a theoretical perspective, i.e., they should not be black box, right? And moreover, theories should be interpretable from a modeling perspective, i.e., they should not be falsifiable, and that's also not be unfalsifiable. Sorry, they should be falsifiable. And that's also something that came up during this discussion at the Rand meeting, right? Is that there's a lot of social science theory out there that is very difficult or hard to test, right? So if you want to work in this space of big data, if you want to work in this world of trying to gather knowledge about the world around us, right, then you should be willing to create theories that are falsifiable, that can be tested within a modeling perspective. And so this led me to generate what I called the TIMIT principle, right? The theory interpretable models and model interpretable theory principle, right? That all social science models using big data should be interpretable from a theoretical perspective, i.e., they should not be black box, and all social science theories applied to big data should be interpretable from a modeling perspective, i.e., they should be falsifiable. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the second half of that, because that's not really my domain. I'm not mainly a theoretician. I work from theory, but I spend a lot more time on the modeling side of things, right? And so I'm going to talk more about the modeling side today. So one question then is, if this is your interest, right, if you buy into this principle and you want to start to build agent-based models that are theory interpretable, how do you do it, right? And I think that there are two solutions. The first is what I'd call parameter optimization type solutions. And these are solutions in which you're actually constructing your agent-based model from a theory from the get-go, right? You're just basically writing down a theory of how agents behave, right? And then you're optimizing the parameters of that theory, the actual numbers that go into that model, to best fit data, right? And when I was at Northwestern, a student by the name of Forrest Stondahl, who is now at Augustana College as a professor, he actually spent a lot of time thinking about this question. He wrote a great thesis on a tool that he built for Netlogo to actually help make parameter optimization very easy. And the tool is called Behavior Search. And it's now part of the standard Netlogo package. It doesn't announce itself, but it's in the folder when you download it. So if you go in there and look, you can find the Behavior Search tool. And what Behavior Search does is it allows you to take a model, tell it what parameters you want it to optimize, and tell it what function you want the model to optimize as well, right? So for instance, you can take something like the flocking model, the Boyd's model, and you can say you want to maximize how far apart the birds are from each other and allow it to control the various parameters of the model. And it will find a set of parameters that maximize that particular objective, right? What I've done with it a lot of times is actually I've built a function within Netlogo which will actually read empirical data that we've generated in some way. For instance, say the adoption of the sales of a product, right? And then I'll build a model that's supposed to simulate sales of a product, and I'll find the set of parameters of that model that best allow me to generate the sales of that product, right, from a historical data set, right? And now I have a fairly true model to what's going on. Now, the other way that's used, and way that's maybe a little bit less used, so parameter optimization, I think, is probably the approach that by far most agent-based modeling literature that uses data in some way uses to fit its model to the data, right? The other way that I feel is less used, but still quite interesting, and has been used, I don't want to say it hasn't been used, we didn't generate this, is rule induction, right? And rule induction is the idea that we can use machine learning or some other tool, statistical models as well, to extract rules of behavior of individuals directly from big data. They construct an ABM, hopefully automatically eventually, from those rules, compare and contrast the model outputs of the data, refine and repeat, right? And there are many kind of standard tools out there like decision trees and random forests and CARs, which is a set of association rules that you could use to generate these rules of behavior, right? We actually have used in my lab quite a bit something called Transcisor, which we developed as from work done by Cosmo Schlese and Jim Crutchfield. And it's a tool that basically extracts a Markov-like model directly from discrete time series data, right? So we can input into it different data and get out a Markov model for any number of agents. And it runs fairly efficiently, right? We can run, in some of the examples we've done like, 15,000 time series and generated all the models in like 10 minutes, right? So we can get fairly good creation of the results. So I'm going to talk about both of these in short today, and we'll go through from there. Good. Okay. So parameter optimization. Let's talk a little bit more about this. And I kind of described it at a high level, but Forrest and I actually wrote a paper back in 2014 that was published at WCSS, the World Congress on Social Simulation, when that was still going on, that the CSSSA was a part of at the time, right? Where we kind of formalized the problem of parameter optimization. The paper is called When Does Simulated Data Match Real World Data, or empirical data? I'm blanking on the exact phrase we use now. And essentially the idea is that if I have a model and I have the real world, right, the validation is the process of making sure that my model in some way matches the real world, right? Now, my model has a set of parameters, right? And I have to tweak those parameters in order to better fit the real world, in order to better get my model to match the world. And I can take the real world that I have, and I can absorb a set of, and one of the things the real world generates is a set of data. And in that data, I can split it up into training data and testing data. Now, one small note, there could also, in a perfect world, there's also the environment of that world besides necessarily the data, right? And these might be things that directly affect the parameters of the model. For instance, in the example I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about people consuming news on the internet, right? And it might be that if we're looking at training data from, say, 2005 and testing data from 2015, right? Well, that's probably too big of a jump, but 2015, 2017, right? The number of actual websites where people consume news has changed, right? So that might be something that's part of the environment. And the reason why I mentioned that is that might be something that directly maps into a parameter rather than having to calibrate it against a parameter. Anyways, all that being said, the goal then of calibration or parameter optimization, right, is to adjust your parameters P such that your model M generates data that's as close as possible to your testing data, right, our test, given some error measure, right? measure by some error. Right? And the training process is the process by which you figure out what those parameters are, right? And you don't manipulate them once you develop the test. So let's talk about the problem that we actually explored this in. So we did this for a test problem too as well, but one of the questions that comes up in this situation is, what is the role of the error function, right? So the error function is what you're using to measure how close your real world model is, your model is to the real world, right? And one of the questions that we had was, if I train with one error function, if I train my model with one error function, and I test with a different error function, what happens, right? Is there an error function that is optimal for training, in the sense that if I train with this error function, regardless of what error function I test with, I still get good results, right? And so that was kind of the question that we wanted to explore, right? And in other words, how does our training of the model affect this validation? So we have this big network. This is from ComScore data, which we had gotten as part of working with Google at the time, right? And we have this data of all these different connections to different news sites, right? And so we could see where people actually clicked around when they were looking for news on the internet. And we wanted to model how people consume news, right, at the time. And so we built what we called a news consumption ABM, and you can see it here, and essentially in Netlogo, right? And essentially the way you can think of it is, we had these little surfer agents that would move around on the network, and they would choose where to go to the next news site based upon network characteristics of the news, right? So they sometimes move to network nodes that had a higher in degree or higher out degree, higher in component, page rank, all these different measures, right? And so we had all these parameters that would affect how they choose which sites they went to, right? We then trained the model using a set of error measures, and we tested using completely different set of error measures, including the same one we trained on. And I should mention briefly, we trained the model in again 2015, I believe it was, data, or no, it must have been earlier than that, 2010 data it says here, and trained on 2008 data, tested on 2010 data. So what were the error measures? Well, the error measures that we looked at were kind of these a group of standard ones. So it's the correlation measure, right? We just looked to see, as an output of this model, what we got was the traffic at every news site, right? So we were simulating all these different surfers going around, and now we know how likely a news site was to be visited. Right? And so what we did was we measured the correlation between the model output data and the real world output data. That was one result we could do. We could also measure what are called the various L measures of error, which L0 is simply count the number of times the two results differ. So if in our real data, the model said the AOL was going to be visited 1,000 times, and in the simulated in the real data, if the real data said 1,000, simulated data it said 1,000, then that would count as being correct, right? And so it would not count against the error measure. But if it was different, it said 1,000 on one and 1,200 on the other, that was different, and we'd count it against the error measure. Right? Of course, Manhattan distance, we would take the two numbers, right, and imagine them in a highly dimensional space, and then we would simply measure the linear distances that it would take to get from that one point to another. Euclidean distance would be the straight line distance between the two. And then there's something called the Chebyshev, or the maximum distance, which is simply, we keep repeating this process of squaring, cubing, taking to the fourth power the difference, then taking the third, the fourth, the fifth root. Right? So we would train with all 5 of these measures, the model, and then we would test with all 5 of these measures, right? And what we would find is we would find how the training with the different error measures affected the testing, right? And so what we found was that there really isn't a good answer to this question. There isn't an optimal error measure, right? And this was true for both a toy problem that we looked at and for this real world problem that we looked at, right? Essentially, what we found was that if you train with correlation, then the model is going to be best at generating data that is well correlated with the underlying data. Right? If you train with the L0, then it's best at generating data that minimizes the error on the L0 measure, right? And then the L1, and then the L2. Now, in these results, you'll notice, right? So this is the top half of this graph is actually training data, and the bottom half is testing data, right? One thing that was interesting was that we did find that the data that was trained with the L2 measure, this Euclidean distance, for whatever reason, did achieve the best error measure on 3 of the 5 error measures. So this did seem to present some evidence that maybe using something like a Euclidean, which is similar to a root mean squared error as well, might be a good solution if you want something that's a little bit more robust. But the results are not very different. And in fact, they are, at times, they're statistically indistinguishable, right? So it would be hard to argue strongly that the Euclidean distance is the best possible, but at least in this particular result, that was what we found out. Okay. By the way, in this table, bold is the best for that row, right? So as you can see, for correlation, it says that correlation is the best, and for L2, it actually says L1. It does the best at L1, L2. So this is one example of parameter optimization, where we took a theory about how people might explore the news, and we use this data. Now, in this case, I'm actually making a methodological point, not necessarily making a substantive point, right? But kind of that's in the spirit of this particular talk. That's more of a methodological. So what's another example of doing parameters optimization? Well, another example, for a while, I was doing a bunch of work on urgent diffusion, and still am to some extent, right? And urgent diffusion is the context where information is diffusing about some sort of event where time plays a critical role, right? And this could occur in things like man-made crises such as biological or terrorist attacks, natural crises such as hurricanes, critical news, right? This time-sensitive global political events, election news, right? And then for firms, it could be brand crises, right? And one of the questions that we had was, is there a good way to model how this information diffuses, especially in today's modern social media world, right? And so one of the things we wanted to try out was what would happen if we took some standard approaches to information diffusion, such as these models that existed for a long time. The BAS model, which was originally developed in 1969, but then we created others as well. We weren't the only ones to just create an agent-based version of it in 2011. Or the independent cascade model, which was created by Goldenberg, Lebye, and Muller in 2001 to study how products get talked about in a market space, right? But both the BAS model was actually originally developed to model the diffusion of things like refrigerators through the American marketplace, right? Very slow-moving things, right? Literally and metaphorically, right? And the cascade model was developed to more understand, talk about new products, right? Not necessarily something that's time critical. So could we use these models in urgent conditions? So we went out and we collected a bunch of data about urgent situations. And in fact, we collected data about the capture and death of Osama bin Laden. We collected data about the 2012 presidential election. And here we collected data about 2 big hurricanes. Kind of ironic to be talking about these right now, since I have another hurricane coming my way in just a few hours. But Hurricane Irene, which was in 2010, and Hurricane Sandy in 2012, right? And these are both hurricanes at the eastern shores of the United States. The lines on this graph may be hard to see if you stare really closely at your monitor, and I'm happy to make these slides available later so you can take a look closer at them. And they're also in a JAS article that we published on this topic. But what the lines show is what we did was we recorded every mention of Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Irene that we found on Twitter. And we then identified individuals who were talking about these. And we drew a line between them if one individual was following another individual on Twitter and that individual had mentioned the hurricane first. So, you know, if Bob follows Alice on Twitter and Alice tweeted about Hurricane Irene before Bob did, then there's a line from Alice to Bob in this graph, right? And it's kind of interesting, you know, this is a Gephi plot that kind of just shows nicely that there are definitely clusters. There are individuals who are the most, who kind of were sources of information, it seems like, about these different hurricanes, right? But this still didn't answer our question, right? Can we just use a standard model to fit to this data? Right? And again, I'm going to make a more methodological point with this than I am going to be a substantiative point, right? The substantiative point is essentially that, yes, these models can be useful, but in fact, in some recent work I've been doing with the University of Central Florida, we found that there's ways to adapt these models to make them even more useful in these cases. But what the methodological point I want to make is because we did parameter optimization, right? We actually fit as many, in this case, we actually did a very simple parameter optimization. We essentially just did a grid search, which means that we took the parameters. There are only two real parameters to these systems, P, which was the probability of receiving the information outside the network, the social network, and Q, which was the parameter that governed whether or not you received information from within the social network, right? And we just fit the output of our model as best as possible to the production of tweets on this particular topics, right? And what we did was we just scanned from 0 to 1, and then increasing levels of refinement, to find areas of those P and Q values that had the minimal error between the output data of the model and the real world data that we observed, right? And what you're seeing here in front of you now are heat maps of some zoomed in parts of that grid search, right? And so a red in this heat map indicates areas of those parameter spaces that don't fit very well to the data, right? And the blue indicates areas that do fit very well to the data. So you get to see some nice kind of trends in this data, right? So first of all, you know, for Irene, using the BAS model, right, you find that this range of P between 0.05 and 0.01 seems to fit fairly well, right? And that there's this nice streak kind of up and to the left. Let me see if I can turn on one of my tools. Here we go. This should work. So hopefully you can see what I'm pointing at now, right? There's this area that kind of matches pretty well to the data, right? And that's very useful for a number of reasons, right? It tells us that, yeah, somewhere in this space there is an optimal point that best fits the data, right? But in reality, the model is fairly robust to small changes in that parameter space, right? That P kind of trades off of Q in this space to some extent, right? And on the other hand, for the BAS model, there's a much larger range of that space that seems to have that this model is robust to, right? And so this kind of gives you insight into whether or not these models are a good fit to the data and how the different parameters affect each other. Now let's talk about one last parameter optimization example, and then I'll move on just to give you a completely different example. This again was a kind of an information diffusion example, but in this particular case, we were using a model that we learned over time at the individual level. So far, most of the models I've talked about, the data was learned at kind of the aggregate level, right? But this is an example where we actually learned the model at the individual level. In this particular case, we actually studied Dig, which was kind of a social media platform similar to Reddit before Reddit existed, right? And what we looked at was the trust between users. And we modeled that trust on a variety of topics: business, entertainment, gaming, lifestyle. And these were labels that were given to us by Dig. They're on it. You had to post in like one of these 10 topic areas. And what we were able to do was, by observing some training data again, we were able to learn the weights that the individuals placed in other individuals near them in terms of these different topics, right? And that was very interesting, right? Because it meant that we could find individuals who were very well trusted in the network, especially, who were very well trusted in the network, right? And when we looked at, for instance, comparing what we call the individuals who are most trusted versus other measures of influence, like how many connections the individuals had, individuals who are more trusted actually generated more activity on Dig than people who have lots of connections. So these graphs right here show, and these are all statistically significant differences. The gray bar shows the individuals who were influential based upon their trust, and the hashed bar shows the individuals who had lots of followers. And what we find is the individuals who are more trusted actually generated more activity on the platform than the individuals who simply had a lot of followers. So this individual level model allows us to get into a much richer view of how influence operated in the Dig network. So that's all parameter optimization, right? And those are 3 quick examples on how you can use parameter optimization combined with agent-based modeling to match models to real-world data. Now I want to switch focuses and talk about rule induction, right? And so the focus in parameter optimization is in altering the micro-level parameters of the system. In some ways, rule induction is very similar. The focus here is in identifying macro-level rules of behavior, right? So one way to think of it is that in parameter optimization, I have a big model, theoretical model, and I have some small, parameters that affect how that model behaves, but I'm leaving the model essentially alone. If you wanted to move from parameter optimization to rule induction, one thing you could do is say, well, what if I have a parameter that controls a rule of behavior, right? Then essentially, I would be heading in the direction of rule induction eventually, right? Rule induction is the idea that we're actually going to build the basic rules of behavior of the model directly from data, right? Rather than having them just be fit to the data. So I'll start with an example that comes from some work that Yandin Liu did in her thesis at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I should mention, I was on this committee. I wasn't a co-author with Yandin, but I really liked what she did. So she was trying to automatically identify rules of behavior to describe how individuals decide what transportation options take to work. With the idea that if we had a model like that, we could then try and incentivize public transportation as opposed to one person driving alone in a big gas guzzler Escalade, right? As much as possible. So Andon used data from a transit mode choice study that had been done in the greater Chicago area. So they had gone out and they basically collected a bunch of demographics about people, like income range, how many children were living in the household, how many people overall were living in the household, how far the house was from the nearest public transit option, right? Whether or not they owned a car, et cetera, right? And she took that data, which was this great rich data set, and she used the machine learning algorithm called class association rules mining to generate rules that would determine which mode of transportation people were using based upon those different options, right? Based upon those different data points, right? So if you had a family and you made over this amount of money and you live far away from public transit, you're going to take a car, right? If you are by yourself and you live close to your work and you don't have a car, you're going to walk, right? And different things like that. And essentially, she found these 404 rules that essentially she could use to model this behavior, right? Now, what's interesting about this, right, is that the rules were the same for every agent, right? But every agent had a set of parameters, right, a set of values of the agent that affected which rules became active at any particular time. Right? And so it's a little bit different way of thinking about it. But essentially, she's creating a policy flight simulator, much like the Holland book describes, and John Sturman also talks about this. So here's the system diagram that she had for her version, right? You have these public policies, such as we're going to invest in the highway transit system. We're going to change zoning laws to affect where people can live. We're going to tax fuel. We're going to tax ownership of the car itself, right? And this all affected things like car ownership, car use, low density land use, auto dominant transportation system, right? And you can think about how these things, these different interventions affect the outcome of those rules, right? So I could use the same rule base that I had from last year for this year, but increase the cost of fuel, and someone might make a different choice, right? And she used this to explore, and what she found is that a lot of times, at least in her set of data, ownership taxes didn't have much effect, because essentially you tax someone $1,000 to buy a car, they're just going to wait another year to buy the car, but then they're going to buy the car and use it all the time, right? But fuel taxes, ongoing taxes, had a much greater effect on decreasing audit use, right? So that was one of her outcomes. So it has this ability to study these flights and these policies. Another example, and one I alluded to a little bit earlier, is basically using kind of these generic frameworks like the Schlesing, Crutchfield, causal state models, epsilon machines, to automatically learn models of behavior from a variety of data. So in our particular case, right, as I mentioned, these time series data can generate these Markov-like models. And we used it to look at the question of whether or not someone was going to tweet in the near future, right? So we built models of 15,000 users of Twitter, right? And we examined, through these models, can we build these models in such a way that they predict accurately whether or not someone's tweeting, right? And what we found, and we compared it to a baseline. Our baseline model was essentially, if you've tweeted more than you haven't tweeted in the recent past, then you're going to tweet in the future, right? And if you haven't tweeted more than you tweeted, then you're not going to tweet, right? And so what I'm showing you here in this graph, the blue dots are showing you how well the causal state model does at predicting any one individual compared to their baseline models, right? And the green dots are for a black box neural network, right? The echo state network, or recurrent neural net, as it's sometimes called, and how well it does it. And all we wanted to show was that this white box model, the causal state model, which actually gives us a state diagram that we could interpret, was able to do at least as well as a black box approach. And the nice thing is that we can actually query this model. We can query this agent-based model and find out why it tweeted on a particular topic, right? Did it tweet on that because some other, or does it, why it predicts that someone will tweet, right? Does it predict someone will tweet because its neighbors tweeted, or because that person's interested in that topic, or whatever, right? And just to give you a cherry-picked example, right? I'll be perfectly honest about this. Here's a user, Daniel Zevi. They tweet on average 45% of the time. So the baseline model is going to predict 45% of the time correctly whether or not they're tweeting. Actually, 55, because it'll do the inverse of the rate, right? But our model is able to predict at almost a 95% accuracy whether or not the individual will tweet in the next 10 minutes, right? So we have a much higher rate of precision. Now, it varies. This is what this graph is showing you, is that for users who tweet all the time, we don't get much improvement over the baseline. And for users who never tweet, we don't get much improvement over the baseline, right? But for these individuals in the middle, which are the hardest individuals to predict, those are the individuals that we do our best job. So using this rule induction method, right, we're now able to we could actually go back, and if we had one of these state diagrams, we could inspect, well, Daniel was in, like, he just has a cycle where he's in a quiescent state where he's just not highly active, but then he goes to work and he becomes active. And we could actually use these models to start to develop theories about whether or not there were certain classes of individuals and how they behave. And David Darman and Michelle Gervin and I have a recent paper out in PRE, Physical Review, where we essentially explore that exact question. Right? Let me mention one last example of rule induction, and then I'm going to wrap up. So just to show you this can be used in kind of more maybe real world examples, this is an example where and I don't want to get too much into the details because this could go on for a while, but we were approached by a hotel company which had a bunch of data about its loyal customers, right? People who had loyalty cards, right? And what they knew was they knew every single marketing channel that they had reached out to the individual with, and whether or not they had booked a hotel room in the near future, right? And we were able to induce models that described how likely each channel was to result in them making a reservation in the near future, right? So if, for instance, we had seen the customer come to the website and make a purchase, look at a hotel room, but not make a reservation, right? Then it might be that our model says that if we send them an email in the next 24 hours, they're much more likely to make a reservation, right? Or it could be that this user, for instance, doesn't usually purchase because of emails, but does purchase because they see a sponsored ad, like an ad on Google. So instead, you should up your ad spend for that particular user, that class of users in the near future. Right? And what's really cool about this is, the standard attribution question in marketing is at the higher level. How much should I be spending on directed search versus social media? But in this case, we could actually ask the question at the lowest possible level. We could ask it at the level of the individual, right? What email will make this particular user make a hotel reservation in the near future? Anyways, so that's one last example of rule induction. So I just wanted to conclude by saying, we essentially can use these models we can use this framework to create models that are constantly being updated and revised and a better fit to empirical data. And these have the potential to avoid the Lucas critique, which comes out of macroeconomics. And Lucas critique basically says, any model you build is going to be invalid as soon as you change the world in which that model lives, right? And that's only basically true if you're not getting a true individual level model out of your system, right? If you get an individual level model and you really understand how individuals make decisions, right, then the model is no longer invalid when you move out of the world in which it was originally validated, right? And so this could potentially be the best possible solution for predicting macro scale policy effects. The vision I have for taking this to the next step, by the way, is that I would love to be able to create large-scale, data-driven models that are updated regularly and automatically, and that could be used in the John Holland and John Sturman sense as true policy flight simulators. Imagine, for instance, the Neanderthal model of all of Chicago, but now it's constantly running for the entire city, taking in all the social media data it possibly can, taking in all the administrative records that the city has, and providing city managers with the ability to determine what kinds of policies they should place to optimize the happiness of the city, right? That, in my mind, would be the true kind of smart city, right? And would really get away. Now, we're not there yet. We're not there yet with that vision. No one's created an agent-based model that does what I'm talking about. But I think what I'm trying to do is partially take steps towards it. So with that, I'll say thanks and have at least 10 minutes for some questions or a little bit of time. You can always reach me elsewise at wmrand@ncsu.edu. Also on Twitter at Bill Rand, of course. BillRand.org is my website, and I highly recommend that if you're interested in agent-based modeling and all these things, check out abm.complexityexplorer.org. It's a MOOC that I started up and ran for 3 years. I recently handed off the reins to Ana Maria Beria, who's one of my postdocs, was a postdoc, but they're still using my videos, so you'll still see my smiling face every time you go there. So, anyways, thank you all.
Thank you. That was really fantastic. And don't forget, folks, type questions into the chat, and we'll make sure they get asked. But just to kick things off, you know, you're in your vision, you said that you know, you like the idea of the model being trained. You create the model, now it's ingesting data, and you've got this real-time policy flight simulator going. As the system is ingesting all of this data, do you see a need for it to relearn periodically? You know, maybe there have been some changes in the relationship among these things, or the decision making and things like that. Should there be some sort of periodic retraining of the model, or how do you see that going?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's the case. Now, we actually have this idea that Darman and I have been kicking around for a while, where the question would be how to detect when you should relearn, right? Like, is there a particular time when you should detect it? And one thought we have is, what if you created a second model, right, that was only learning from the most recent data, right? That was kind of built every month from scratch, essentially, or something like that, right? That model, so theoretically, if I have one model that's trained on, say, a year's worth of data, and I have another model that's trained on just the last month or 2 months of data, the short-term model theoretically should almost never do better than the long-term model in predicting, because it just doesn't have enough data to truly learn the behavior of what's going on with it. If it did, though, right? If it did, that might be a good indication of a regime change in the system, right? Something where you need to actually change your model substantially. So we've had some thoughts about trying to explore that from a theoretical perspective, right? Could we build a system and show that that is the case, right, in a real world system? And there's obviously some ways we can do that.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, you could even imagine having a whole suite of models, and various ones, as they start to do less well at predicting, get dropped, and new ones are created and added to the mix, and you've got some sort of voting system that goes on as far as what the result is seen. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with getting too much into these big ensemble models, right? It depends. They have to be constructed well to be useful from a theoretical perspective, right? So getting back to the very beginning, right? If we want these models to be theoretically interpretable, right, and we have ensemble models that are kind of just throwing everything at them, it becomes kind of difficult to determine what is actually driving outcomes, right? But if you did it well, I think there are ways you could address
that. Yeah, I mean, you know, again, it would be fascinating to start to explore the combination of these things, where you've got sets of black box data only, you know, correlative structure kinds of models, and then a slower progression of these more theory-driven models that are also engaged. And yeah, that's fascinating. Are there questions from anybody else? The chat is not exactly exploding, shall we say? Oh, let's see. The Lou citation.
Yeah, Lucas.
Yeah,
Lucas.
Lucas.
Yeah.
Is that something you can provide?
Yeah, don't think I have it easily. Let me see. I could stop sharing now, but I definitely can. Maybe it's best to provide that afterwards in some way.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. We can push that out and make it available.
Yeah, it's getting a little dated, right? It was 2008, 9, something like that, right? But it was a fascinating piece of work. I actually got involved because Moira Zellner, who does a lot of actually interesting work on agent-based modeling of water use systems, she was also on that committee, and she asked me to come over and kind of be the agent-based modeling expert in that space. But it was was a very interesting dissertation.
So do you see this as the next big step for agent-based modeling, or is there an air gap that we still need to fill before we can start really doing these data-driven, theory interpretable agent-based models?
That's a good question. This is the next big step that I'm pursuing. Let's put it that way. I think I could fairly answer that. I think in general, I think the next big steps in agent-based modeling are going to deal with integrating agent-based modeling better with other methodologies, right? So one thing I didn't talk about today that is kind of related to this topic is the combination of behavioral lab experiments, right, and agent-based models. So another place that you could get your rules from, right, would be from running experiments in a lab, seeing how people play games, and then inducing rules directly from the way they play those games in those experiments, right? And that we have a paper on that. I have a paper on that with Ned Smith at Management Science. That's very interesting and about the benefits of doing that. I think this trying to figure out different places to draw data from and combining that with agent-based modeling, I definitely think that is a next big step.
Okay, so actually that's a very good point, and a beautiful segue into our next question. So, a lot of times, it's sort of, why are you looking for your contact over here when you lost it over there? Well, the lighting's better. You end up, social media is a great data set, but it's not necessarily representative of the population. Mm-hmm. And so, do you see that as introducing potential biases into the rules that are created and things like that? And are there ways of trying to limit that bias in the model that's ultimately created?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I should say, first of all, let's be clear, right? Social media has become a powerful enough force in our world that studying it for its own sake is a useful endeavor, right? So let's even if it's biased, it's not biased about itself, right? So it's useful to study it for that perspective. Let's say, just as, but the question is very fair, right? That it may not be representative, as even I mentioned early on in my talk, of what people are actually doing or thinking or believing, right? And it may underrepresent certain parts of the population. It's actually the case that social media, certain platforms tend to overrepresent parts of the population that have been underrepresented in traditional survey approaches, for instance, which is interesting, right? It tends to overrepresent minorities, which is interesting compared to a lot of other approaches. But that all aside, I do think there are biases that could be corrected for, right? And ideally, in kind of the big picture vision of this, if you're using this for actually planning a city or something like that, ideally you're not just using social media, right? You're also using all the data feeds that something like the city is generating, right? You're using the administrative data, right, that the city might typically collect as well, right? So you have a camera on, outside the police station, right? And you monitor how many cars drive by that road, right? Or you have these little strips across the roads, right, where you count how many cars go by, right? And you take all that in together along with the social media data, right, and all these other patterns, these digital data sources, and you build a valid model from those combined sources rather than any one source, right? And the nice thing about biases is that assuming that there is some presence of that bias, like some part of the population is represented in some way on that platform, right? Even if it's underrepresented, right? Hopefully we can correct for those biases over time by learning of those representation biases.
And what about bias in not just representation of parts of the population, but also in human behavior? So I behave one way on a regular basis, but then a hurricane does come by and I change my behavior radically. That isn't necessarily represented in my previous behavior.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I think this is actually almost exactly the same as the, it's a similar to the question of how do we know if we need to relearn the model, right? So it's essentially comes down to anomaly detection in the data, right? Like, is this individual behaving differently in some way right now than what I expected them to behave in the past, right? And again, if we have our models at the individual level, right, not at the aggregate level, and we see that that individual is straying from the predictions a lot, right, then that would be an indication that potentially we need to retrain the model, right? And when it comes to big events like a hurricane or something that's very observable from the outside world, right, then that's something that we theoretically should know. Well, we've never seen a hurricane in this model before, right? So we don't know how it's going to react, or we don't know how it's going to compare, right? So I would, that's when the Lucas critique really does kind of come into place, right? Is something that's really helpful. Now, my hope is that if we build those models at the individual level, we have goal-driven agents who are really acting according to whatever their signals are. Even in the presence of a hurricane, we'd at least get some validity with the agent-based model. But that's a hope and a hypothesis rather than a proof.